The November fog of 1894 had settled upon London like a great grey cat, stretching its languid form across every street and alleyway with a silence that seemed almost supernatural. From the windows of our modest lodgings at 212 B. Baker Street, the world beyond appeared as nothing more than shifting phantoms and the occasional amber glow of a gas lamp struggling against the encroaching gloom. It was on such an evening, when the very air seemed thick enough to cut with a blade, that there came to us the most peculiar case I have ever had the privilege to record, a mystery that would test even the remarkable faculties of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. My friend had spent the better part of the day in that state of restless melancholy which I had learned to recognize as the precursor to either a brilliant deduction or a week-long retreat into the solace of his violin. He lay stretched upon the sofa, his lean frame coiled like a spring under tension, his keen grey eyes half-closed in apparent contemplation. The sitting-room bore the familiar signs of his intellectual pursuits. Chemical apparatus scattered across the side table, 3 different monographs on tobacco ash, open and cross-referenced, and his violin case lying open beside him like a patient companion. "It is intolerable, Watson," he murmured suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife through silk. "The criminal classes have grown decidedly pedestrian. Where is the artistry? Where is the intellectual challenge that separates the master craftsman from the mere burglar?" I looked up from my medical journal, which I confess I'd been reading with little attention, my mind wandering to the hypnotic rhythm of the rain against our windows. "Surely a respite from mayhem is welcome, Holmes. Even your considerable energies require occasional rest." "Rest?" He sat up abruptly, his eyes now fully alert and gleaming with that familiar intensity. "My mind is like a racing engine, Watson, tearing itself to pieces because it is not connected to the work for which it was designed. I require a puzzle, something that defies conventional logic and demands the full application of the deductive method." As though the universe itself had been listening to his complaint, the doorbell below rang with a tentative, almost apologetic chime. Holmes's head snapped toward the sound like a hound catching a scent, his nostrils actually flaring with anticipation. "A client, Watson, and one in considerable distress, if I'm not mistaken." Note the hesitant nature of the ring, pressed once, then again more firmly, as though the caller were wrestling with doubt even as they sought our assistance. Within moments, Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread sounded upon the stairs, accompanied by lighter, more uncertain footsteps. When our landlady appeared at the door, she bore that expression of mingled curiosity and resignation that Holmes's visitors so often inspired in her practical nature. "A Mr. Cornelius Ashworth, too. See you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "He says the matter is most urgent, though he seems reluctant to explain why." The gentleman who entered our sitting-room was a study in contradictions. Perhaps 50 years of age, he possessed the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. Yet his manner suggested someone whose confidence had been recently and thoroughly shaken. He was impeccably dressed in a suit of charcoal wool, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his hands steady as they gripped a walking stick of polished ebony. Yet it was his eyes that betrayed him, pale blue orbs that darted about our room with the nervous energy of a trapped bird. Holmes rose with fluid grace, gesturing toward the chair opposite his own. "Mr. Ashworth, please be seated. You have traveled some distance in this weather, despite having access to a private carriage. The mud on your boots is from Hampstead Heath, yet you arrived on foot. Most curious." Our visitor started, his composure slipping for just a moment. "How could you possibly know that, Mr. Holmes?" "The clay adhering to your left boot is a distinctive reddish variety, found only in the northern reaches of the Heath, where the recent excavations for the new reservoir have exposed the deeper soil layers. Yet your right boot bears the standard London street mud of our immediate vicinity. This suggests a walk across the Heath, followed by a journey through our local streets. Your coat is dry, indicating the use of a carriage for the main portion of your journey, yet your boots tell the tale of the final approach on foot. You wish to arrive unobserved, perhaps?" Mr. Ashworth sank into the proffered chair, his hands trembling slightly as he accepted the glass of brandy I offered. "Your reputation for observation is well deserved, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I walked the final distance. I could not risk my coachman knowing my destination. The matter I bring to you is of such a delicate nature that discretion is paramount." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, assuming that attitude of intense concentration I knew so well. "Pray tell us your story, Mr. Ashworth. Omit no detail, however trivial it may seem. Dr. Watson here will take notes, and I assure you that whatever you reveal will be treated with the utmost confidence." Our visitor drew a deep breath, gathering himself like a man preparing to leap across a chasm. "I am the curator of the Ashworth Collection, Mr. Holmes, a private museum of historical artifacts housed in my family's estate in Hampstead. The collection has been in our family for 3 generations and includes some of the most significant relics of English history. Medieval manuscripts, Tudor jewelry, artifacts from the Civil War, items of immeasurable historical value." "And something has gone missing from this collection?" Holmes inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The centerpiece of our entire collection," Ashworth replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The Whitmore key, a silver key dating from the reign of Henry VIII, said to have opened the private chambers of Cardinal Wolsey himself. It is not merely valuable in monetary terms, though it could fetch thousands at auction. It represents a direct connection to one of the most pivotal periods in our nation's history." Holmes leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "And the circumstances of its disappearance? That is what makes this matter so utterly inexplicable," Ashworth continued, his composure beginning to crack. "The key was housed in a specially constructed display case in the heart of the collection, a case designed by the finest craftsmen in London. The lock is a masterpiece of engineering, requiring a key of such precise specifications that it cannot be duplicated. There are only 2 keys to this case in existence, one that I keep on my person at all times, and another that was placed in our family vault upon my father's death, sealed away according to his wishes." "The case itself," Holmes interjected. "Describe its security measures in detail." "It sits within the sanctum, the most secure room of the collection. The sanctum has but one entrance, a door of reinforced oak 3 inches thick, fitted with a lock of my own design. The room has no windows, and the walls are solid stone. I am the only person who possesses the key to this room, and it never leaves my person." "Yet the key has vanished," Holmes observed. 3 days ago, I conducted my weekly inspection of the collection. Everything was in perfect order. The Whitmore key gleamed in its place of honor, surrounded by the other artifacts. I locked the case, secured the sanctum, and retired for the evening. Yesterday morning, I returned for another routine inspection." He paused, his hands gripping the arms of his chair with such force that his knuckles had turned white. The sanctum was locked, exactly as I had left it. The display case showed no signs of tampering, no scratches, no damage to the lock mechanism. Yet when I opened it, his voice trailed off into silence. "The key was gone," Holmes supplied gently. "Vanished without a trace. But in its place, Mr. Holmes, resting upon the velvet cushion where the Whitmore key had lain, was this." From his waistcoat pocket, Ashworth produced a small object wrapped in a tissue paper. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the wrapping to reveal what appeared to be a key, but one crafted entirely from folded paper with such exquisite precision that it seemed to capture every detail of the original artifact. Holmes took the paper key with a pair of tweezers, examining it under the gaslight with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he murmured. "The technique is Japanese. Origami, I believe it is called. But observe, Watson, the message inscribed along the shaft." I leaned closer, squinting to make out the microscopic script that ran along the paper keys. Surface: "What was taken softly shall return in time's proper measure." "The work of an artist," Holmes continued, but also of someone with intimate knowledge of your collection and its security measures. Tell me, Mr. Ashworth, who else has access to the sanctum?" "No one," Ashworth replied firmly. "I am the sole guardian of the collection. My household staff are forbidden from entering the room, and I have never granted access to any outside party. The sanctum has been my private domain for 20 years. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing before the fireplace, the paper key still held delicately in the tweezers. "And yet someone has entered this impregnable fortress, removed an irreplaceable artifact, and left behind an artistic calling card that suggests both mockery and promise. The phrase, 'taken softly,' implies a gentle removal rather than a violent theft. Return in time's proper measure suggests this is not permanent acquisition, but temporary borrowing." He stopped suddenly, fixing Ashworth with that penetrating gaze that had unnerved countless clients and criminals alike. "Mr. Ashworth, I must ask you directly, is there anyone who might claim a legitimate right to the Whitmore key? Any dispute over ownership? Any family claim that might have been overlooked?" A shadow passed across our visitor's features, and for a moment I thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as though each one caused him physical pain. "There is one possibility, though I pray it is not the case. My younger brother, Edmund, always maintained that our father had promised him certain items from the collection, including the Whitmore key. Edmund was unstable, Mr. Holmes, given to flights of fancy and grandiose schemes. When our father died and left the entire collection to me as the elder son, Edmund became quite bitter. We had not spoken in 15 years when he died last winter in India." "And did Edmund leave any heirs?" "A son, Marcus. He returned to England 6 months ago, having served with distinction in Her Majesty's forces in Afghanistan. He has made several attempts to contact me, but I assumed he wished to press his father's old claims. I have refused to see him." Holmes returned to his chair, his eyes bright with the fire of intellectual pursuit. "Mr. Ashworth, you have presented me with a most intriguing puzzle. A locked room that has been entered without force, an irreplaceable artifact that has vanished without violence, and an artistic signature that suggests we are dealing with someone of considerable education and skill. I shall take your case." "Thank God," Ashworth breathed, relief flooding his features. "When might you be able to examine the scene?" "Tomorrow morning at first light," Holmes replied decisively. "I shall need to inspect both the sanctum and the display case, interview your household staff, and examine any other security measures you may have in place. But I warn you, Mr. Ashworth, this case has the hallmarks of something far more complex than a simple theft. The artistic nature of the replacement, the precision of the entry, the philosophical message, these suggest we are dealing with someone who views this not as a crime, but as the rectification of an injustice." After our visitor had departed into the swirling fog, Holmes stood at the window, the paper key still in his hand, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across our sitting room, and the silence that followed Ashworth's departure seemed pregnant with possibility. "Well, Watson," he said at last, turning to face me with that familiar gleam of anticipation in his eyes. "What do you make of our latest puzzle?" I considered the matter carefully, organizing my thoughts as I had learned to do when dealing with Holmes's cases. "It seems clear that this nephew, Marcus, has somehow gained access to the collection and taken what he believes to be his rightful inheritance. The artistic replacement suggests education and refinement, qualities one might expect in a military officer. The message implies he intends to return the key eventually, perhaps after establishing his legal claim. A reasonable hypothesis, Holmes conceded, though I detected that note of reservation in his voice that suggested he had already seen beyond the obvious. Yet there are elements that trouble me, Watson. How does one enter a locked room without forcing the lock? How does one open a specially designed case without the proper key? And why announce the theft with such an elaborate calling card, thereby ensuring immediate discovery and investigation? He moved to his chemistry table, placing the paper key under a magnifying glass and studying it with renewed intensity. No, my dear fellow, I suspect we are dealing with something far more sophisticated than a simple case of family dispute. This origami key is not merely a replacement. It is a message, a challenge, perhaps even a clue to the method by which the theft was accomplished. You think the thief is taunting us? I think, Watson, that we have encountered an adversary who views crime as an art form and investigation as a game worthy of his talents. The phrase, softly vanished, suggests not just the quiet nature of the theft, but perhaps a metaphor for the method itself. What vanishes softly, Watson? What disappears without force or violence? I pondered this question as Holmes continued his examination of the paper key, his mind already racing ahead along paths of logic that remained invisible to my more conventional thinking. Outside, the fog pressed against our windows with increasing intensity, as though London itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the revelations to come. "Time, Holmes," I said suddenly. "Time vanishes softly. We hardly notice its passing until something we treasured is gone." Holmes looked up from his magnifying glass, a slow smile spreading across his sharp features. "Excellent, Watson. Time indeed vanishes softly, and with it, the certainty of our perceptions. Tomorrow's investigation should prove most illuminating. I've a feeling that the case of the softly vanished key will challenge not only our deductive abilities, but our very understanding of what is possible within the realm of human ingenuity." As I prepared to retire for the evening, I could not shake the feeling that we stood on the threshold of an adventure that would test Holmes's remarkable abilities to their utmost. The mystery of the vanished key seemed deceptively simple on its surface, yet I had learned long ago that the most straightforward cases often concealed the most elaborate deceptions. Whatever truth lay hidden within the walls of the Ashworth estate, I had no doubt that Sherlock Holmes would uncover it, though the path to revelation might prove more twisted and treacherous than either of us could yet imagine. The fog continued its silent siege of London, muffling the sounds of the great city and transforming familiar streets into alien landscapes. Somewhere in that grey wilderness, a thief who preferred artistic statements to crude violence was perhaps congratulating himself on a masterful theft. Yet he had made one critical error. He had attracted the attention of Sherlock Holmes, and that, as I had witnessed many times before, was a mistake few criminals survived with their freedom intact. Dawn had scarcely broken when Holmes roused me from sleep, his energy crackling with that peculiar intensity I had learned to associate with a promising investigation. He stood at our sitting-room window, fully dressed, the mysterious paper key held delicately between his fingers as he studied it against the pale morning light filtering through the fog. "Come, Watson," he urged as I descended the stairs. "I have spent the night considering the physical impossibilities presented by Mr. Ashworth's account, and I confess they intrigue me greatly. Time is of the essence in these matters, and I am eager to examine this supposedly impregnable fortress." Our hansom cab rattled northward through streets still slick with moisture, past shopkeepers opening their establishments and workers hurrying toward their daily labors. Holmes sat opposite me, his collar turned up against the chill, that curious brightness in his eyes which told me his mind had been far from slumber during the night hours. "You observed yesterday, Watson," he remarked suddenly, his sharp profile etched against the blurred window. "That time vanishes softly, but I wonder whether Mr. Cornelius Ashworth has been entirely candid regarding his use of time on the evening in question." "You suspect him?" I exclaimed, startled by the implication. "I suspect everyone and no one until the data is complete," Holmes replied with characteristic precision. "But consider the omissions in his narrative. He did not tell us at what precise hour he last saw the Whitmore key, nor whether anyone had pressed him for access to the sanctum in recent weeks. Omissions, my dear fellow, are frequently more instructive than statements." As we climbed toward Hampstead Heath, The buildings grew more spacious and elegant, speaking of old wealth and established families. The Ashworth estate revealed itself gradually through the thinning fog, a Georgian manor of considerable proportions built of pale stone that seemed to glow faintly in the diffused light. Yet there was something melancholy about the place, as though the weight of its accumulated treasures had pressed the very joy from its stones. Mr. Ashworth himself met us at the entrance, looking considerably more haggard than he had the previous evening. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he ushered us into a grand entrance hall dominated by marble columns and portraits of stern ancestors. "Forgive my appearance, gentlemen," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "I have not slept since discovering the theft. Every time I close my eyes, I see that damnable paper key mocking me from its velvet cushion." Holmes's sharp gaze swept the hall with methodical precision. "Quite understandable. Now, before we examine the sanctum, I require absolute precision regarding the evening of your last inspection. At what hour did you quit the room?" "A little after 9, I should think." "And from 9 until when were you in company that can vouch for your whereabouts?" Ashworth frowned slightly at the implication, but responded with commendable exactness. "My housekeeper brought me hot milk at 11:15. I was in the library writing letters. After that, I retired." We followed our host through corridors lined with glass cases containing artifacts of every description, the accumulated weight of history pressing upon the senses. At last, we reached a heavy oak door set into a stone archway, the entrance to the sanctum. The door was indeed formidable, its surface unmarred by any scratch that might suggest forced entry. Holmes knelt before the lock, producing his magnifying glass and examining the mechanism with minute attention. He ran his fingers over the door's surface, pressed his ear against the wood, then looked up with a frown. "The lock shows no signs of picking or tampering. If this door was opened by anyone other than yourself, Mr. Ashworth, they possessed a duplicate key of flawless manufacture." "Impossible," Ashworth insisted. "The mold was destroyed when the lock was installed." The heavy door swung inward to reveal a windowless chamber illuminated by gas lamps. The walls were lined with display cases of polished mahogany and glass, but the central pedestal commanded attention, standing alone like an altar, its empty case a monument to violation. Holmes moved immediately to the floor, beginning a methodical spiral from the doorway. "Watson," he called suddenly, "observe the dust patterns near the left wall. Do you see the irregularity?" I moved closer, noting a faint disturbance in the dust. "It appears someone stood here for quite some time." "Precisely. Between the floor's last polishing and the discovery of the theft, a second person was in this room." Holmes straightened, his expression grim. "Someone who knew to avoid the direct line of sight from the door." At that moment, heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor, and a young voice rang out with military authority. "I demand to know what is happening. You cannot bar me from my own family home." Ashworth stiffened visibly. "Marcus," he whispered. A young man burst into the doorway, his bearing unmistakably that of a soldier. He stopped short upon seeing the empty case, then fixed us with a defiant stare. "So it is gone, then, and you've brought in investigators to pin it on me?" Holmes stepped forward calmly. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, at your service, and if you are half as clever as your dramatic entrance suggests, perhaps you'll explain what you meant by your uncle's sanctum not being quite as secure as he pretends." Marcus Ashworth stood framed in the doorway like a figure from a military portrait, his bearing unmistakably that of a soldier despite the civilian clothes he wore. Perhaps 30 years of age, he possessed the sun-weathered complexion of one who had served extensively in Her Majesty's Eastern campaigns, and his eyes held that peculiar combination of intelligence and barely suppressed frustration that I had observed in many veterans returning to England's more civilized shores. "I meant precisely what I said, Mr. Holmes," he replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "My uncle's fortress is more theatrical than practical. Any man with proper training and sufficient motivation could breach these defenses. Cornelius Ashworth's face flushed crimson. "How dare you speak of matters you cannot possibly understand? This collection has been secured by the finest craftsmen in London." "Craftsmen you employed 20 years ago," Marcus countered sharply. "Tell me, uncle, when did you last examine the structural integrity of this room? When did you last verify that the original architectural plans matched the current reality?" Holmes raised a hand, his gesture commanding immediate silence from both men. "Mr. Marcus Ashworth, your arrival is most opportune, though I confess the timing raises certain questions. When did you last attempt contact with your uncle regarding the collection?" The young man's jaw tightened visibly. 3 weeks ago. I wrote requesting a meeting to discuss certain items my father believed were rightfully his. The letter was returned unopened, as were the previous 4 attempts over the past 6 months. "And your whereabouts 3 nights past, between the hours of 8 and midnight?" "At the Army and Navy Club, dining with Colonel Weatherby and Major Harrison. We discussed my prospects for a position with the India office until well past 11. I can provide their addresses if required." Holmes nodded slowly, his penetrating gaze never leaving Marcus's face. "You mentioned the fallibility of this room's security. I require specifics, not generalities." Marcus glanced at his uncle, whose expression had shifted from anger to something approaching genuine apprehension. The Ashworth estate incorporates elements of an earlier manor house, including service passages that once connected the main building to the kitchens and stables. My father showed them to me as a child, before the great estrangement. One passage runs directly behind the north wall of this very room. "Impossible," Cornelius interjected, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Those passages were sealed decades ago when the renovations were completed." "Were they?" Marcus challenged. "Or did you simply assume they were sealed because the visible entrances were bricked over?" He moved toward the heavy tapestry that adorned the north wall. "May I demonstrate, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes gestured his assent, and Marcus drew aside the Flemish weaving to reveal what appeared to be solid stone. However, he pressed firmly against a section near the floor, and to our amazement, a narrow panel swung inward with the faint grinding of neglected hinges. "The passage beyond is cramped but navigable," Marcus explained. "It emerges behind the bookcase in the corridor outside. The bookcase itself can be moved. I had a local carpenter install concealed rollers beneath it months ago, hoping eventually to demonstrate the security flaw to my uncle." Cornelius Ashworth had gone pale, his earlier bluster evaporating like morning mist. "But this would mean someone could enter without using the door, without requiring my key. The entire security of the collection would be compromised." "It would mean precisely that," Holmes agreed grimly, "though whether this passage was utilized by your nephew, by some other party aware of its existence, or indeed by someone with an entirely different method, remains to be determined." Before Marcus could respond, he produced a crumpled envelope from his tunic pocket. "Mr. Holmes, I must tell you something else. I came here today not merely to press my claim, but because I received this yesterday." Holmes seized the letter eagerly, examining the paper and postmark with intense scrutiny. "Posted in Whitechapel at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Cheap paper, standard ink. The handwriting is deliberately disguised." He read aloud, "The key is gone. They will blame the soldier. Flee while you can." "Why would the thief warn you?" I asked, bewildered by this development. "Unless," Holmes mused, returning the letter to Marcus, "the thief wishes to ensure your presence here, to complicate the narrative. By fleeing, you would confirm guilt. By remaining, you provide an excellent suspect while the true culprit operates freely." Holmes moved back to the empty display case, examining it once more with his magnifying glass. "Mr. Ashworth, you stated that only 2 keys exist for this mechanism, yet I detect traces of foreign matter in the lock. Not oil or dust, but something more deliberate." He straightened, his expression grave. "Gentlemen, we are dealing with someone who possesses intimate knowledge of both this collection and the Ashworth family dynamics. Someone who can manipulate events from the shadows while remaining invisible. The question is no longer how the key was taken, but why someone wishes to orchestrate this particular drama. The fog outside had begun to lift, but the mystery surrounding us had only deepened with each revelation. Holmes moved with renewed purpose toward the violated display case, his keen eyes scrutinizing every surface with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. The morning light filtering through the sanctum's gas lamps cast sharp shadows across his angular features as he knelt before the mechanism that had somehow yielded its treasure to an unknown hand. "Watson, observe the lock mechanism closely," he instructed, producing his magnifying glass and a set of delicate probes from his coat pocket. "The brass shows no scratches from picks or jimmying, yet there are traces here that speak of careful manipulation." I leaned closer as Holmes inserted a slender instrument into the keyhole, his movements precise and deliberate. After a moment, he withdrew the probe and held it toward the light, where I could see a fine, crystalline powder clinging to its tip. "Powdered resin," Holmes announced with satisfaction. An old technique, though rarely employed with such sophistication. By dusting the interior of a lock and observing how the powder adheres to the metal surfaces, a patient individual can map the exact configuration of the tumblers and wards. Our thief studied this mechanism at leisure, Watson, creating a mental blueprint before ever attempting to open it. Marcus Ashworth stepped forward, his military bearing unable to conceal his growing unease. "You mean someone stood in this very room examining the lock while my uncle believed his collection secure?" "Precisely," Holmes replied, rising and moving toward the secret passage Marcus had revealed. "But the question remains, how did they gain access to conduct such an examination?" He squeezed into the narrow opening, his voice echoing from within the cramped space. "The dust patterns here tell a fascinating tale. Recent footprints, to be certain, but observe their direction, Watson." I peered into the gloom, noting the disturbed dust Holmes indicated. "They seem to lead away from the sanctum rather than toward it." "Exactly so. Someone used this passage to exit the room, not to enter it, which suggests they gained access through conventional means, the door itself, and utilized the passage only for their departure." Holmes emerged from the opening, brushing dust from his clothes. "Mr. Ashworth, I must inquire about your household staff. Who has served here longest?" Cornelius Ashworth's face had grown increasingly pale during Holmes's examination. "Mrs. Dalrymple, my housekeeper, has been with the family for over 40 years. She began service under my grandfather and knows every stone of this house." "I should like to speak with her immediately," Holmes declared. "I fear that is impossible," Ashworth replied, wringing his hands nervously. "She departed yesterday morning, claiming a family emergency in Kent. Most unusual, as she has taken no leave in 15 years and has no living relatives that I am aware of." Holmes's eyebrows rose sharply. "Her absence at this precise moment is remarkably convenient. Tell me, does Mrs. Dalrymple possess knowledge of these hidden passages?" "She would have learned of them from the previous generation of servants, certainly. The passages were common knowledge among the staff before the renovations sealed the visible entrances." Moving back toward the display cases lining the walls, Holmes's attention was drawn to a narrow cabinet containing an array of delicate Eastern artifacts. His eyes fixed upon a collection of intricate paper sculptures, fans, flowers, and geometric forms crafted with extraordinary precision. "These origami pieces," Holmes observed, opening the cabinet with careful reverence. "They represent the same school of paper folding as our mysterious calling card. The technique is unmistakably Japanese, requiring years of study to master such precision." He lifted one of the paper creations, examining its delicate folds against the light. "Mr. Ashworth, how long have these been in your collection?" "They were a gift to my father from a Japanese scholar who visited England some 25 years ago, Professor Yamamoto, if memory serves. He spent several weeks cataloging our medieval manuscripts and left these as tokens of appreciation." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "My father was fascinated by those pieces. He attempted to teach me the art during my childhood, before his departure for India. I remember him saying there was philosophy in folded paper, that what appears solid can be transformed, that nothing is truly permanent. Holmes replaced the origami carefully, but his expression had grown thoughtful. Philosophy indeed, the art of transformation, of making the complex appear simple and the simple complex. Our thief possesses not merely technical skill, but an aesthetic sensibility that speaks of extensive education and cultural refinement. He began pacing the sanctum with that restless energy I knew indicated his mind was processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. Consider the elements before us, gentlemen. We have a theft accomplished without force, a lock bypassed through patient study rather than crude manipulation, an artistic replacement that demonstrates both skill and philosophical inclination, and a household staff member whose absence coincides precisely with the crime's discovery. "You suspect Mrs. Dalrymple?" Marcus asked. "I suspect everyone and no one until the evidence speaks conclusively," Holmes replied. "But I find it curious that someone with intimate knowledge of this house's hidden architecture should vanish at the moment her expertise might prove most valuable to our investigation." Cornelius Ashworth sank into a chair near the empty display case, his earlier composure completely shattered. "If Mrs. Dalrymple is involved, then no aspect of my security was genuine. She could have observed my routines, noted my habits, perhaps even obtained impressions of my keys. The possibility cannot be dismissed," Holmes agreed grimly. "Yet something troubles me about this theory. A woman of her age and station, after 40 years of faithful service, suddenly turns to elaborate theft. The psychology seems inconsistent unless—" He paused, his eyes narrowing with sudden insight. "Unless what, Holmes?" I prompted. "Unless she was not acting of her own volition, but rather under compulsion or in service to someone else's design. The true architect of this crime may remain hidden, using others as instruments while maintaining perfect invisibility." At that moment, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor beyond, and a young housemaid appeared at the sanctum entrance, her face flushed with exertion and anxiety. "Begging your pardon, sir," she addressed Cornelius breathlessly, "but there's a gentleman at the door insists on speaking with you about Mrs. Dalrymple. Says he's her solicitor and has urgent business regarding her affairs." Holmes and I exchanged meaningful glances. The timing of this visit, like so many elements of our case, seemed too convenient to be mere coincidence. "Show him to the morning room," Holmes instructed before Cornelius could respond, "and inform him that we shall join him presently. It appears, gentlemen, that Mrs. Dalrymple's sudden departure has attracted attention from quarters we had not anticipated." As we prepared to leave the sanctum, Holmes cast one final penetrating look around the violated chamber. "The web grows more complex with each revelation, Watson. Yet I begin to sense the presence of a master manipulator, someone who has orchestrated events from the shadows while allowing others to appear as the obvious suspects. Our next conversation may prove most illuminating indeed." The mystery of the Whitmore key had evolved far beyond a simple case of theft, revealing layers of deception and misdirection that spoke of a criminal mind, of unusual sophistication and patience. The morning room into which we were ushered possessed that peculiar quality of English refinement where understated elegance spoke more eloquently than ostentation ever could. Pale winter light filtered through tall windows overlooking frost-touched gardens, yet the atmosphere within held a tension that seemed to press against the very walls. The gentleman who awaited us rose with obvious relief upon our entrance, his weathered hands clutching a leather document case with the desperate grip of one bearing unwelcome news. "Mr. Cornelius Ashworth?" he inquired, bowing slightly. "I am Arthur Kellaway of Kellaway, Finch and Associates, Lincoln's Inn Fields. I fear I bring distressing intelligence regarding your housekeeper, Mrs. Martha Dalrymple." Holmes stepped forward before our host could respond, his keen eyes already cataloguing details of the solicitor's appearance and demeanor. "Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are investigating matters connected to this household. Your timing suggests more than coincidence, Mr. Kellaway." The solicitor's expression grew grave. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, Mrs. Dalrymple collapsed yesterday evening outside King's Cross Station. She was conveyed to University College Hospital, where she lingered long enough to make certain statements before succumbing to what the physicians described as acute cardiac failure brought on by severe emotional distress." Cornelius Ashworth sank heavily into the nearest chair, his face draining of color. Martha? Dead? But she was in perfect health when she departed yesterday morning. The attending physician indicated she had been under considerable strain for some time, Kellaway continued. Her final words concerned this household and certain knowledge that weighed heavily upon her conscience. She pressed this into my hands with instructions that it be delivered immediately to you, in the presence of witnesses. He withdrew a sealed envelope from his case, its surface bearing Cornelius's name in the familiar, careful script I had observed on household documents throughout the estate. Holmes accepted the envelope, examining the paper quality and postmark with characteristic thoroughness before breaking the wax seal. "Note, Watson, the tremor in certain letter formations," he murmured, "written under extreme duress, yet the content was clearly planned in advance." He unfolded the letter and read aloud in his clear, precise voice. "My dear Mr. Cornelius, when this reaches you I shall be beyond earthly judgment, though not, I pray, beyond divine mercy. For 20 years I have carried secrets that were not mine to bear alone, bound by promises to your late father and to another whose name honor forbids me to reveal. Yet recent events have convinced me that silence now serves wickedness rather than loyalty." Holmes paused, his eyes scanning ahead before continuing. "The collection you guard so carefully has long been known to those who would claim portions of it by right rather than theft. Your brother Edmund's departure was not the simple family quarrel you believed, but the result of discoveries that threatened the very foundation of the Ashworth legacy. The proof lies where you would least expect to find it, hidden in plain sight among treasures you have admired without truly seeing." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his military bearing unable to conceal growing agitation. "What proof? What discoveries?" Holmes held up a restraining hand and continued reading. "I've observed late-night visitors to the sanctum, figures who moved with knowledge of passages you believed sealed forever. I have seen documents examined by lamplight, heard whispered conversations in rooms that should have been empty. When approached by one who knew my dependence and would use my position for purposes I dared not contemplate, I could no longer remain silent." The letter concluded with specific instructions regarding a small iron strong-box concealed beneath the floorboards of Mrs. Dalrymple's former quarters, along with a final cryptic message: "Seek the truth where memory dwells, for the past casts long shadows over the present." Kellaway produced a second item from his case, a small brass key of intricate design. "She entrusted this to my keeping as well, with instructions that it opens something of vital importance to your family's honor." Holmes examined the key with intense interest, noting its unusual craftsmanship and the faint traces of green corrosion that suggested considerable age. "This is no common household key, Watson. Observe the elaborate ward pattern and the distinctive maker's mark. This was crafted by a master locksmith, possibly decades ago." He turned to Cornelius with renewed intensity. "Mr. Ashworth, Mrs. Dalrymple's final message references memory dwelling somewhere specific. Is there any location within your estate particularly associated with family records or personal mementos?" "The memory chamber," Cornelius replied slowly, comprehension dawning in his eyes. "A small room adjacent to the library where my grandfather kept family documents and personal effects. It has remained largely undisturbed since his death 30 years ago." "Then that shall be our next destination," Holmes declared, pocketing the brass key. "For I suspect Mrs. Dalrymple's death was precipitated not by guilt over the theft itself, but by knowledge of who orchestrated it and why. The Whitmore key may prove to be merely the opening gambit in a far more complex game of family secrets and long-deferred justice. As we prepared to investigate this new lead, I could not escape the feeling that Mrs. Dalrymple's sacrifice had provided us with the crucial thread needed to unravel a mystery that stretched back generations, touching upon questions of inheritance, honor, and the dangerous power of buried truth. The memory chamber proved to be a repository of accumulated secrets, its narrow confines thick with the scent of aged leather and forgotten memories. Unlike the grand display rooms of the collection, this space possessed an intimate melancholy, its walls lined with glass-fronted cabinets containing personal effects and leather-bound journals that spoke of lives long concluded. Holmes moved immediately toward a mahogany writing desk, positioned beneath the room's single window, his keen eyes noting how every other piece of furniture seemed arranged to face this central piece. "Observe, Watson," he remarked, running his fingers along the desk's ornate surface. "The craftsmanship speaks of German origins, with modifications suggesting someone valued security above mere aesthetics." He produced Mrs. Dalrymple's brass key, examining its intricate ward pattern against the desk's various locks. The late housekeeper understood precisely where this would fit. The key turned smoothly in what appeared to be a decorative keyhole, revealing a hidden compartment lined with green velvet. Within lay 3 leather-bound journals, their spines unmarked, but their pages clearly filled with dense handwriting, along with a small iron strongbox bearing the Ashworth family crest. Holmes opened the earliest journal with characteristic care, his eyes scanning the entries with rapid intensity. "Your grandfather's hand, dating from 1847, he announced. "The entries concern various acquisitions for the collection, but note this passage marked with red ribbon." He read aloud. "Edmund has discovered disturbing correspondence among Cardinal Wolsey's papers, suggesting the Whitmore key's acquisition by our ancestor may have involved coercion during the dissolution of the monasteries. If his research proves accurate, we possess not legitimate inheritance, but the spoils of Tudor-era opportunism." The revelation struck both Ashworths like a physical blow. Marcus stepped forward, his military bearing unable to conceal growing agitation, while Cornelius appeared unable to form coherent words. Holmes continued reading from subsequent entries, revealing years of investigation that confirmed Edmund's suspicions about the key's questionable provenance. "Your grandfather was caught between justice and family honor," Holmes observed, opening the strongbox with the same brass key. "These documents show he established an anonymous trust fund for the Whitmore descendants, attempting to provide restitution without acknowledging guilt." He withdrew a rolled parchment sealed with the family arms. "And this appears to be a codicil to his will, directing that certain disputed items, including the Whitmore key, be returned to their rightful owners upon proof of legitimate claim." But Holmes's attention had been drawn to something more immediate. He examined the final journal with his magnifying glass, frowning at several pages near the end. "These entries have been tampered with recently, Watson. Observe the torn edges where pages have been carefully removed. Someone has been studying these journals and editing their contents within the past few months." Marcus moved closer, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "My father's correspondence with the Whitmore descendants, that's what's been removed, isn't it? Someone wanted to hide the fact that contact had been established." "Precisely," Holmes replied grimly. "Mrs. Dalrymple mentioned late-night visitors who moved with knowledge of passages believed sealed. Someone has been accessing this room regularly, studying your family's guilty secrets and removing evidence they deemed dangerous." He straightened, his expression growing more intense. "But they made one crucial error, gentlemen. In their haste to conceal certain truths, they left behind proof of their presence." From the strongbox, Holmes withdrew a small origami crane, its paper yellowed with age, but its craftsmanship unmistakably matching the style of the calling card left in place of the stolen key. "This piece has resided here for decades, yet it connects directly to our current thief. The technique is identical, suggesting either the same artist or someone trained in the same school of paper folding. Professor Yamamoto, Cornelius whispered, comprehension dawning. The Japanese scholar who catalogued our manuscripts 25 years ago. He left several origami pieces as gifts, including that crane. Holmes nodded slowly. And someone with intimate knowledge of that connection has been orchestrating recent events. The theft of the Whitmore key was not random criminality, gentlemen, but the culmination of a carefully planned campaign of restitution. Our thief possesses detailed knowledge of your family's history, access to your estate's hidden passages, and the patience to study your routines over an extended period. He moved toward the chamber's entrance, his mind clearly racing ahead along paths of deduction that remained invisible to the rest of us. Mrs. Dalrymple's death was precipitated by her knowledge of this person's identity and methods. She could no longer bear the weight of complicity in covering up both historical crimes and current manipulation. But who? Marcus demanded. Who has such intimate knowledge of our family's secrets? Holmes paused at the threshold, his grey eyes bright with the fire of approaching revelation. Someone who has been hiding in plain sight, Watson, using their position of trust to orchestrate events while remaining above suspicion. The answer lies not in distant descendants or foreign collectors, but much closer to home. Tomorrow's investigation will reveal the true architect of this elaborate drama, I have no doubt. As we prepared to leave the memory chamber, I could not escape the feeling that Holmes had already identified our quarry, but was withholding his conclusions until he could spring the trap that would expose them completely. The mystery of the softly vanished key had evolved far beyond simple theft, revealing layers of historical guilt and contemporary manipulation that spoke of a mind both brilliant and ruthless in its pursuit of what it perceived as justice. The night following our discoveries in the memory chamber found Holmes in a state of intense intellectual ferment, his mind working with that peculiar energy I had learned to recognize as the prelude to significant revelation. Rather than seeking rest, he occupied himself until the small hours with his chemical apparatus, conducting experiments whose purpose remained tantalizingly opaque. The acrid scent of various compounds filled our sitting room as he worked with microscopic samples collected from the Ashworth estate, occasionally consulting reference volumes on subjects ranging from Japanese paper-making techniques to the dissolution of English monasteries. "The final threads are weaving themselves together, Watson," he remarked as dawn broke over London's rooftops. "Our adversary has demonstrated remarkable sophistication in orchestrating this elaborate scheme, but they have left traces that speak eloquently to those who know how to interpret them." Morning brought urgent word from Cornelius Ashworth requesting our immediate return to the estate. Upon our arrival, we found the household in considerable disarray, with our host pacing the entrance hall like a man wrestling with invisible demons. "Mr. Holmes, the most extraordinary development has occurred," he announced breathlessly. "This morning I discovered another origami piece upon my breakfast table, a paper dove of exquisite craftsmanship bearing a message that has left me utterly confounded." Holmes accepted the delicate sculpture with characteristic care, unfolding it to reveal microscopic script. The key returns to its rightful guardian when truth is acknowledged. Justice delayed need not be justice denied. Await resolution at sunset in the garden where memory dwells. "Our thief grows bold," Holmes observed, though his tone suggested satisfaction rather than concern. "They announce their intentions openly, confident that even with advance warning we cannot prevent their chosen resolution." He turned to me with sudden intensity. "Watson, the time has come to examine the one aspect of this estate we have thus far neglected, the servants' quarters themselves." We followed a nervous housemaid through narrow service corridors to Mrs. Dalrymple's former room, a Spartanly furnished chamber that reflected a life dedicated to service and order. Holmes moved immediately to the small writing desk near the window, his keen eyes noting details that escaped ordinary observation. "Observe, Watson," he he murmured, lifting the desk blotter to reveal faint impressions in the wood beneath. Someone has been writing here recently, pressing heavily upon the paper. He produced a small mirror, holding it at an angle to decipher the ghostly script. Dates and times, a schedule of movements within the house. And here, a name written repeatedly, Yamamoto. His attention turned to the modest bookshelf beside the bed, fingers dancing along the spines until they stopped at a worn volume on Japanese culture and art. Opening it carefully, a single sheet of folded paper fluttered to the floor, another origami crane, but this one crafted from a page torn from an old inventory ledger. The connection becomes undeniable, Holmes declared, examining the paper with his magnifying glass. This is not random artistry, Watson, but documentary evidence. Observe the entries, items from the Ashworth collection, including the Whitmore key, with notations in Japanese characters. Marcus, who had joined us silently, stepped forward. My father taught me some Japanese during his correspondence with Professor Yamamoto. Those characters mean wrongfully taken or stolen property. Holmes straightened, his expression brightening with the fire of complete comprehension. Mrs. Dalrymple was not merely a passive observer. She was documenting a conspiracy that stretched back decades. But she was not the architect. She was the faithful keeper of secrets for someone else, someone who used her loyalty and access to facilitate their patient campaign of restitution. Who? Cornelius demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone whose position allowed unrestricted movement throughout the estate, who possessed the necessary education to appreciate both historical context and artistic symbolism, and who maintained a personal connection to Professor Yamamoto's visit 25 years ago. Holmes moved toward the window, gazing out over the mist-shrouded grounds. Tell me, Mr. Ashworth, who designed the Japanese-style water garden visible from this very window? Cornelius followed his gaze, comprehension dawning slowly. My cousin Julian. He studied landscape architecture in Kyoto before returning to manage our grounds. He's lived in the cottage by the old stables since 1880, and he was Professor Yamamoto's translator during that memorable visit. The final piece, Holmes announced with quiet triumph. Julian Ashworth, the scholar gardener with intimate knowledge of the estate's secrets, deep connections to Japanese philosophy and art, and a motive rooted in historical justice. He has been orchestrating the return of items he believes were wrongfully acquired by your ancestors. Julian, Cornelius gasped, but he is the gentlest soul imaginable, spending his days with bonsai and poetry. Precisely the temperament for an artist who views restoration as a philosophical imperative rather than mere theft, Holmes replied. Someone who would choose to softly vanish a key rather than steal it violently. Come, gentlemen, sunset approaches, and I believe our scholarly thief is preparing to reveal his final masterpiece. As we hurried across the wet lawns toward the distant gardener's cottage, the mystery's elegant architecture stood fully revealed, a campaign of artistic justice orchestrated by a mind that valued symbolism over profit and moral rectitude over legal technicalities. The approach to Julian Ashworth's cottage led us through a transformation that seemed to transport us from Victorian England into an altogether different realm of aesthetic philosophy. The Japanese garden unfolded before us with deliberate artistry, each stone and carefully raked gravel pattern speaking of decades spent in contemplation of Eastern principles. Even in winter's grip, the space possessed a haunting beauty that seemed to suspend time itself, with bare branches, casting intricate shadows across patterns that suggested flowing water frozen in meditation. Holmes paused at the garden's entrance, his keen eyes scanning the scene with that peculiar intensity I had learned to associate with the final moments before revelation. The faint scent of burning sandalwood drifted through the chill air, carrying with it an unmistakable sense of ritual preparation that made the approaching confrontation feel less like the apprehension of a criminal and more like attendance at some solemn ceremony. Observe the arrangement, Watson, he murmured, indicating the meticulously composed elements surrounding us. Every stone speaks of deliberate placement. Every shadow falls with intention. Our quarry has not merely awaited discovery, he has prepared the stage for his final performance. Before we could advance further, the cottage door opened with the soft whisper of wood on wood, revealing a slender figure silhouetted against the warm glow of paper lanterns within. Julian Ashworth stood framed in the doorway, no longer the humble gardener we had expected, but transformed into something approaching a scholar-priest. His simple working clothes had been replaced by a robe of deep indigo silk, his silver hair bound back in the Japanese style, and his bearing possessed that quality of serene dignity that comes from absolute moral certainty. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his cultured voice carrying clearly through the stillness, "I have been expecting you since the moment I placed the paper key in the sanctum. Your reputation for unraveling the most complex human motivations is well deserved." Holmes stepped forward, his own demeanor shifting to match the gravity of the moment. "And yours for patience and artistic precision has been thoroughly demonstrated, Mr. Ashworth. The origami signatures were masterful, messages that spoke more eloquently than any conventional confession." Julian's smile held profound sadness, mixed with something approaching relief. "Please, all of you, enter. There are truths that require proper atmosphere for their revelation, and the sunset approaches with its own inexorable schedule." The cottage interior revealed itself as a sanctuary of minimalist elegance that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of English domestic architecture. Scrolls of Japanese calligraphy adorned the walls, their flowing characters catching the light from carefully positioned paper lanterns. A low table had been prepared with delicate porcelain cups, but what commanded immediate attention was the object resting upon a silk cushion at the room's center, the Whitmore key, gleaming softly in the lantern light, surrounded by a perfect circle of folded paper cranes. Cornelius gasped audibly, his hand reaching instinctively toward the silver artifact before stopping mid-gesture. "Julian, the key! How could you violate everything our family has protected?" Julian raised a gentle hand, his gesture carrying the authority of one who had spent years preparing for this precise moment. "Peace, cousin. The key is safe, as it has always been. It was never stolen in the crude sense you imagine, but borrowed for a lesson that could no longer be delayed." He moved with fluid grace to pour tea from a ceramic pot, his movements possessing the measured precision of ceremony. 25 years ago, Professor Yamamoto opened my eyes to truths our family had chosen to ignore. He recognized artifacts in our collection that bore the stains of historical injustice, sacred objects torn from their rightful contexts during periods of conquest and dissolution. Holmes accepted the offered cup, his gray eyes never leaving Julian's face. "And so you began your quiet campaign of correction. The items that mysteriously vanished from the collection over the years were not lost, but restored to their proper guardianship through discreet channels." "Precisely," Julian confirmed, settling onto a cushion with practiced ease. "Mrs. Dalrymple discovered my activities years ago, but understood the moral burden I carried. She had heard my grandfather weep when he believed himself alone, tortured by knowledge of acquisitions that violated his conscience. She witnessed Edmund's moral anguish when he uncovered the same truths and was dismissed as a troublesome idealist." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his military bearing unable to conceal growing comprehension. "My father knew the collection contained stolen artifacts. That's why he left England, not from bitterness over inheritance, but from shame at participating in perpetuating historical theft. Edmund possessed the only genuine moral courage in our generation," Julian agreed solemnly. "He corresponded extensively with the descendants of wronged families, promising restitution that Cornelius refused to honor after inheriting the collection. My cousin has always valued comfortable possession over uncomfortable justice." Holmes leaned forward, his expression intent with intellectual curiosity. But the technical aspects of your final gambit. How did you accomplish the removal from the supposedly impregnable sanctum? The lock showed remarkable sophistication in its defeat. Julian's weathered features brightened with something approaching professional pride. Professor Yamamoto taught me many disciplines beyond gardening and paper folding, Mr. Holmes. The art of understanding mechanical systems through patient observation was among his gifts. I spent months studying the display case mechanism through the hidden passage markers revealed, applying powdered resin to map the internal configuration, creating wax impressions of the lock's components until I could craft a duplicate key of perfect specifications. You entered the sanctum through conventional means, Holmes observed with satisfaction, when Cornelius admitted you for routine consultations about landscaping matters. Once inside, you had unlimited time to study the mechanism and prepare your materials. The secret passage served only for your unobserved departure. Your reconstruction honors my methods, Julian acknowledged with a slight bow. The timing was crucial. I required Cornelius to discover the substitution quickly enough to summon investigation, yet slowly enough for the symbolic impact to register fully. The paper key was not mere mockery, but philosophical commentary on the nature of temporary possession. Cornelius's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. And Mrs. Dalrymple, her sudden departure, her collapse, she died carrying the weight of your secrets. Julian's composure faltered for the first time, genuine anguish flickering across his features. Martha's death weighs more heavily upon my conscience than any other aspect of this affair. When she told me she could no longer bear the burden of complicity, I placed the brass key to the memory chamber in her hands and begged her to act according to her own moral judgment. I had planned to reveal myself at today's sunset, regardless of your investigation's progress. I never imagined her heart would fail under the strain of divided loyalties. He rose and moved toward the window, where the dying light painted the garden in shades of amber and crimson. The Whitmore key represents more than monetary value or historical curiosity, gentlemen. It symbolizes 5 centuries of injustice, taken by force during the dissolution of the monasteries, retained through legal technicalities that ignore moral reality. The true owners have waited generations for acknowledgement of their loss. Holmes stood as well, his mind clearly racing along the final threads of deduction. You constructed this entire drama not merely to return a single artifact, but to force a confrontation with historical truth that your family has spent generations avoiding. The investigation itself became your instrument of revelation. I placed my faith in the great Sherlock Holmes's dedication to complete truth, regardless of where such truth might lead, Julian replied. I knew that only someone of your intellectual integrity could uncover the full story without destroying the innocent in the process. The cottage fell silent, except for the soft whisper of wind through bamboo and the distant sound of evening settling over the Ashworth estate. The mystery of the vanished key had been solved, but the greater question of justice hung in the air like incense, waiting for resolution that would determine not merely the fate of a silver artifact, but the moral legacy of an entire family line. Outside, the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in the deep purples and golds that herald the transition from day to night. Julian's chosen hour of revelation had arrived, and with it, the moment when Cornelius Ashworth would be forced to choose between the comfortable certainties of inherited possession and the uncomfortable demands of historical justice. The silence that followed Julian's confession possessed the weight of accumulated generations, each unspoken moment heavy with the moral complexity that had brought us to this lantern-lit cottage on the edge of the Ashworth estate. Cornelius stood rigid near the doorway, his face cycling through expressions of shock, betrayal, and something approaching reluctant comprehension. Marcus remained by the window, his military bearing unable to conceal the turmoil of witnessing family mythology crumble before his eyes. Holmes broke the stillness with characteristic precision, though I detected beneath his usual analytical detachment a current of something deeper, perhaps respect for the moral courage that had driven Julian's elaborate campaign. Mr. Julian Ashworth, you have orchestrated a drama that spans decades, employing methods that demonstrate both artistic sensibility and technical mastery. Yet you have also committed theft under English law, regardless of your philosophical justifications. The question now becomes whether the pursuit of historical justice excuses violation of contemporary legal structures. Julian turned from the window, his expression serene despite the gravity of Holmes's observation. I have never denied the technical criminality of my actions, Mr. Holmes. When I began this path 25 years ago, I accepted that legal consequences might follow moral necessity. Professor Yamamoto taught me that true justice operates on timescales beyond individual lifetimes, and that sometimes one must sacrifice personal freedom to serve principles larger than oneself. Noble sentiments, Holmes replied, though his tone carried that note of reservation I had learned to recognize when he was withholding crucial information. Yet they ignore the practical reality that your methods have caused genuine suffering. Mrs. Dalrymple died under the burden of secrets you placed upon her shoulders. Your cousin has been tormented by violation of his sanctuary. Marcus has been manipulated into appearing as a convenient suspect while you orchestrated events from safety. Marcus stepped forward suddenly, producing a worn leather portfolio from his coat and placing it upon the low table beside the Whitmore key. There is more to this story than even you know, Mr. Holmes. My father spent his final years in India, not in bitter exile, but in active correspondence with the descendants of families wronged by our ancestors. This contains 15 years of research, every questionable acquisition documented, every rightful claimant identified, every possible path to restitution carefully mapped. Holmes examined the portfolio with keen interest, his fingers moving through the carefully organized documents with the reverence of a scholar handling primary sources. Remarkable thoroughness. Your father approached historical justice with the same methodical precision that characterizes proper detective work. Yet these documents also reveal something else. Correspondence between Edmund and Julian spanning decades, coordinating research and planning eventual restoration. My father and Julian were collaborators, Marcus confirmed, his voice tight with long-suppressed emotion. When Edmund left England, Julian remained as the inside agent, documenting the collection and preparing for eventual correction. The plan was always to force acknowledgement through dramatic revelation rather than quiet theft, to create a moment that would compel moral reckoning. Cornelius's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. So I have been living within an elaborate construction designed to expose my moral failures. My security was illusion, my confidence misplaced, my entire stewardship a mockery. Not mockery, Julian corrected gently, but test. I needed to know whether you possessed the capacity for moral growth, whether confrontation with undeniable truth might crack the shell of comfortable certainty you have built around historical crimes. The paper key was invitation, cousin, an opportunity to choose transformation over rigidity. Holmes rose and moved toward the silk cushion where the Whitmore key rested in its circle of paper cranes. But he did not touch the artifact. Instead, he regarded it with the same analytical intensity he might bring to examining evidence of a crime, which in many ways it was. The technical aspects of your scheme have been thoroughly revealed, Mr. Julian Ashworth, he observed. The moral dimensions remain contested territory where reasonable minds might disagree. But practical matters now demand resolution. He turned suddenly toward Cornelius with that penetrating gaze that had unnerved countless clients and criminals alike. Tell me, what precisely do you propose regarding the key's ultimate disposition? Before Julian could respond, Holmes continued with increasing intensity. For I should perhaps mention that Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard awaits my telegraph, should I judge criminal prosecution the only viable resolution. He knows nothing yet of your family's historical complications. Whether he learns them as part of a public trial, with all the attendant scandal and exposure, or not at all, rests entirely upon the decision made in the next few minutes." Julian's eyes widened slightly, though his composure never wavered. "You brought the law to the doorstep, Mr. Holmes, yet kept it outside the garden." "I brought the possibility of law," Holmes corrected with surgical precision. "What steps through this threshold depends upon whether family honor can overcome personal pride." He fixed Cornelius with an unwavering stare. "You stand at a crossroads that will define your legacy for generations. You may insist upon legal prosecution, thereby ensuring public exposure of every questionable acquisition in your collection. Or you may embrace the opportunity Julian's intervention has created to transform the Ashworth collection from monument to historical opportunism into model of restorative justice." The cottage fell silent once more, but this silence possessed a different quality, not the suspension of uncertainty, but the pregnant pause before inevitable revelation. Cornelius walked slowly to the window, staring out at the darkened garden where Julian's artistry had created beauty from discipline and restraint. For a long moment, he seemed to age before our eyes, the rigid certainty of the collector crumbling to reveal the uncertain human beneath. "My father knew," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Grandfather knew, they all knew, and they passed the burden down like a poisoned inheritance. They told me it was my duty to protect the collection at all costs." He turned back to face the room, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But perhaps the greatest protection is to ensure the collection contains only what is honorably held." Marcus moved to stand beside his uncle, his military bearing softened by genuine compassion. "The Whitmore family still exists, Uncle. They live modestly in Derbyshire, preserving their own records of the loss for 15 generations. They seek neither revenge nor financial compensation, only acknowledgement that injustice occurred and the return of what was taken from their ancestors' chapel." Cornelius reached out with trembling hands and lifted the silver key from its velvet cushion, but held it loosely, without the possessive grip he had displayed throughout our investigation. A shudder passed through his frame as though a physical weight were being lifted from his shoulders. "Julian," he said quietly, his voice gaining strength with each word, "you have caused me immense distress. You have violated my trust and disrupted my household, and yet, you have shown more courage than any of us. You are right. The cycle must break." He turned to Holmes with newfound dignity. "Mr. Holmes, I believe our business is concluded. The key has been found. There was no theft, merely a misunderstanding within the family regarding the movement of certain items. I trust your discretion in reporting this to the authorities." "My discretion is absolute in matters where justice has been served, regardless of legal technicalities," Holmes replied with a slight bow. "And might I suggest that the misunderstanding extend to the immediate preparation of certain documents regarding the permanent transfer of the Whitmore key to its original owners?" "It shall be done," Cornelius agreed, his voice now steady with resolve. "Marcus, will you assist me? There is much correspondence to review, and I find I have little appetite for facing the past alone." "I would be honored, Uncle," Marcus replied, a genuine smile breaking through his military reserve. Julian Ashworth bowed deeply, the movement fluid and graceful in his indigo robes. "Then the lesson is concluded. The key has vanished softly from your possession, Cornelius, but what returns in its place is something far more valuable. Peace of mind and the knowledge that our generation chose courage over comfort." As we prepared to leave the cottage, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The tension of investigation had dissolved into something warmer, a sense of resolution that went deeper than the mere solving of a puzzle. The night air outside felt cleaner, sharper, as though the fog of deception had finally lifted from the Ashworth estate. Holmes paused at the garden gate, looking back at the illuminated window where the three Ashworth men stood together, united not by the bonds of shared secrets, but by the difficult, necessary work of confronting truth. The paper cranes in the cottage window caught the lantern light, their delicate forms casting intricate shadows that danced like memories finally set free. "Come, Watson," he said softly, turning his collar up against the chill. "The game is over, and for once, I believe everyone has won. A rare outcome in our profession, wouldn't you agree? Sometimes the greatest mystery is not who committed the crime, but who possesses the courage to make it right." The mystery of the softly vanished key had indeed been solved, but its resolution had revealed something more valuable than any silver artifact: the transformative power of moral courage when applied to the shadows of the past. As our hansom cab carried us back through the London fog, I reflected that this case would stand among Holmes's finest, not for its intellectual complexity, but for its demonstration that even the most elaborate deceptions could serve the cause of ultimate truth. The hansom cab that carried us back through London's fog-shrouded streets seemed to traverse not merely the physical distance between Hampstead and Baker Street, but the philosophical gulf between crime and justice that the Ashworth affair had so thoroughly explored. Holmes sat opposite me, his angular features relaxed in the dim carriage light. The intense energy that had driven our investigation now replaced by that contemplative satisfaction I had learned to associate with cases that challenged not merely his deductive abilities, but his understanding of human nature itself. "A most singular resolution, Watson," he remarked, drawing thoughtfully on his pipe as the familiar sights of our neighborhood emerged from the gloom. "We began with what appeared to be an impossible theft and concluded with what might more accurately be described as an elaborate moral intervention. Julian Ashworth proved that crime, when elevated to the level of art and guided by philosophical principle, can serve purposes that transcend mere criminality. Upon our return to 221B Baker Street, we found Mrs. Hudson had maintained the fire and prepared a late supper, the warmth of our sitting room providing welcome refuge from both the evening chill and the emotional complexities we had witnessed. Holmes moved immediately to the mantelpiece, where he had placed the delicate origami key that had started our entire investigation, examining it once more with the reverence of a scholar handling an ancient manuscript. "Observe the precision, Watson," he murmured, holding the paper creation toward the gaslight. "Every fold deliberate, every angle calculated to achieve maximum symbolic impact while maintaining structural integrity. It serves as a perfect metaphor for Julian's entire campaign, complex in execution, yet unified in purpose, transforming simple materials into something that carries meaning far beyond its physical composition." 3 days later, a messenger arrived bearing a package wrapped in rice paper and sealed with the Ashworth family crest. Within lay a letter from Cornelius, written in his careful hand, informing us that the Whitmore key had been formally returned to its rightful owners with appropriate ceremony and acknowledgement of historical injustice. The Whitmore family had received not merely their ancestral artifact, but formal recognition of the wrong done to their ancestors 5 centuries past. "Marcus has agreed to serve as curator of a reformed collection," Holmes read aloud, "with Julian providing scholarly guidance regarding the provenance of every artifact. Those items whose acquisition cannot withstand moral scrutiny will be returned or donated to appropriate institutions with full documentation of their histories." The letter concluded with news that Inspector Lestrade's inquiries had been satisfied with an explanation of family misunderstanding, and that a foundation had been established to support historical research into restorative justice. Holmes set down the correspondence with evident satisfaction, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar brightness that emerged when contemplating problems solved through understanding rather than punishment. "You seem almost pleased that no arrest was made," I observed, noting the unusual contentment in his manner. "Indeed, Watson, this case demonstrated that the detective's role need not always culminate in prosecution. Sometimes our greatest service lies in facilitating truth that permits genuine transformation rather than merely identifying guilt that demands punishment." He moved to his violin, drawing the bow across the strings to produce a haunting melody that seemed to echo the philosophical complexities we had encountered. Julian's methods were technically criminal under English law, yet they served to correct a far greater crime that had been perpetuated through legal channels for generations. How does one weigh such competing claims? By what standard do we judge when breaking law serves higher moral purpose? I found myself reflecting on the peculiar journey we had undertaken, from the apparent impossibility of a locked room theft to the revelation of an elaborate campaign of historical justice. We had set out to catch a thief and had instead facilitated a family's redemption, transforming inherited guilt into acknowledged responsibility and ultimately into restorative action. Will this case find its way into your chronicles? Holmes asked suddenly, pausing in his playing. I believe it must, I replied, though I confess uncertainty regarding how to present events that defy conventional categorization. Our readers expect criminals apprehended and justice served in clear, unambiguous terms. Then perhaps this case will serve to expand their understanding of what justice can mean, Holmes suggested with a slight smile. Present it as you have witnessed it, a mystery solved not through punishment, but through revelation, where the greatest crime was not the theft of a silver key, but the perpetuation of historical injustice through generations of willful blindness. As Holmes returned to his music, the notes rising and falling like the fortunes of the Ashworth family, I began organizing my notes for the account you have just read. The case of the softly vanished key had indeed tested Holmes's remarkable abilities, but in ways that transcended mere deductive reasoning, requiring not just intellectual brilliance, but moral judgment regarding when prosecution serves justice and when it merely perpetuates cycles of harm. Outside, the great city of London slumbered under its blanket of fog, concealing countless other mysteries waiting to be unraveled. But for tonight, the game was concluded, leaving behind not victims and villains, but a family restored to honor and a detective content with justice served through transformation rather than retribution. The silver key had vanished softly from the Ashworth collection, but what had returned in its place? Acknowledgement of truth, commitment to restitution, and the possibility of redemption proved far more valuable than any historical artifact could ever be. The weeks following our resolution of the Ashworth affair brought with them that peculiar quality of philosophical unrest which I had learned to recognize as the aftermath of cases that challenged not merely Holmes's deductive abilities, but his fundamental understanding of justice itself. London had exchanged its November fog for December's crystalline clarity, and within our Baker Street lodgings, Holmes occupied himself with an unusual pursuit. The delicate art of paper folding that Julian Ashworth had elevated to criminal sophistication. It is a discipline of remarkable precision, Watson, he observed, his long fingers working methodically with a square of rice paper. One must perceive the final form within the flat sheet before making the first crease, not unlike the deductive method itself, seeing inevitable conclusions within chaotic data. You are studying Julian's techniques? I inquired, setting aside my medical journal to observe his efforts. I am attempting to understand the mind that could orchestrate such an elaborate moral intervention, Holmes replied, and in doing so, I am reminded of evidence I chose to withhold during our final confrontation, proof that could have ended the affair with scientific certainty rather than philosophical revelation. Before I could respond to this intriguing admission, Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread sounded upon the stairs, accompanied by lighter, more hesitant footsteps. She appeared at our threshold, bearing that expression of mingled curiosity and resignation that Holmes's visitors so often inspired. "A Miss Catherine Whitmore to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "Says she's traveled from Derbyshire specifically to thank you." The young woman who entered possessed that quality of quiet dignity that speaks of character forged through adversity rather than inherited privilege. Perhaps 25 years of age, she wore simple but well-maintained clothing, and her eyes held intelligence that suggested education far beyond what modest circumstances might imply. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, her voice steady despite obvious nervousness. I hope you will forgive this unannounced intrusion. I've come to thank you for your role in our family key's return and to share information that may interest you regarding the affair's deeper dimensions." Holmes indicated the chair opposite his own, his keen eyes already bright with renewed interest. "Miss Whitmore, your journey is most welcome. What brings you through such weather to our quarters?" She accepted the tea I offered before producing a small leather portfolio. "What you may not know is that Julian's intervention was not merely tolerated by my family, it was actively coordinated with our full knowledge and consent. My grandfather recognized that the Ashworth conscience required dramatic confrontation rather than quiet negotiation. Julian understood that Cornelius needed to experience violation before comprehending the violation his ancestors had perpetrated upon ours. This revelation clearly surprised Holmes, whose expression shifted from polite attention to intense focus. The portfolio revealed correspondence spanning years, documenting patient collaboration between the Whitmore family and Julian Ashworth that had anticipated nearly every development we had witnessed. So we were participants in a drama whose script had been written long before we entered the stage, Holmes mused, rising to pace before the fireplace. "Essential participants," Miss Whitmore corrected gently. "Julian specifically requested your involvement because only someone of your intellectual integrity could navigate the complexities without destroying innocent parties. Your investigation itself served as catalyst for Cornelius's transformation." I found myself both impressed and unsettled. We were guided along paths others had prepared while believing we conducted independent investigation. "Not manipulation, Watson, but collaboration," Holmes replied with wry amusement. "Julian proved himself worthy by understanding that the greatest detective work facilitates revelations that permit genuine understanding, rather than imposing solutions upon resistant subjects." Miss Whitmore withdrew a final item, a delicate origami crane crafted from silver paper that caught the firelight with ethereal beauty. "Julian asked me to present this as acknowledgement of your role in bringing our family's ordeal to honorable conclusion. He says it represents transformation that occurs when patience, skill, and moral courage work toward justice transcending individual lifetimes." Holmes accepted the creation with uncharacteristic reverence. "Please convey my compliments on a campaign executed with remarkable sophistication. He has taught me that investigation itself can serve as instrument of transformation." After Miss Whitmore departed, Holmes stood at the window holding the silver crane. "Watson, I must confess the botanical evidence I mentioned earlier. The origami key's paper contained microscopic coal dust and London soot, proving it was handmade in Julian's greenhouse weeks before the crime. I could have ended the charade instantly with forensic science." "Why did you not?" Holmes gazed into the fire, the light softening his sharp features. "Because to reduce Julian's decades-long campaign of historical rectification to plant fiber analysis would have been Philistinism. He had constructed moral drama meant to save his family's soul. I chose to let the mystery's softness remain intact." He placed the silver crane beside its paper predecessor on the mantelpiece, two artifacts standing as monuments to a case that had elevated crime to philosophy. "There is a Japanese concept. Julian taught me. Mono no aware, sensitivity to existence's ephemeral nature. The solid key was heavy with guilt. The paper key was light with truth. The fragile thing proved stronger than metal." Outside, snow continued its silent descent upon London, burying the city's grime beneath pristine white, just as truth had washed away historical stains. The mystery had been solved, then solved again, each revelation deepening rather than simplifying our understanding of events that would forever stand among our most philosophically complex encounters. The key had vanished softly and returned quietly, accomplishing what centuries of conventional appeals had failed to achieve: acknowledgement of historical wrong and commitment to restorative justice echoing through generations yet unborn. The Christmas season had settled upon London with that peculiar mixture of celebration and contemplation which characterizes the English winter, transforming our great city into a landscape where the year's accumulated mysteries seemed to find their natural resolution. Within our Baker Street lodgings, Holmes had returned to his customary pursuits, yet I detected a subtle shift in his approach. A willingness to consider moral complexity alongside factual certainty that the Ashworth affair had awakened within his brilliant intellect. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell steadily beyond our windows, a final communication arrived from the estate. The envelope bore Julian's elegant calligraphy, and within lay not merely correspondence, but an extraordinary creation, a key crafted from translucent vellum that caught the firelight like stained glass, its surface inscribed with microscopic text in both English and Japanese characters. Holmes examined the delicate artifact with profound appreciation before reading the accompanying letter aloud. My dear Mr. Holmes, as this remarkable year concludes, I write to share the unexpected consequences of your investigation. The public acknowledgement of our collection's problematic provenance has attracted scholars from throughout Europe, transforming what might have been scandal into academic opportunity. Museums and universities now view the reformed Ashworth collection as a model for addressing historical injustices embedded within institutional holdings. The letter continued with news that Marcus had discovered his true calling in restorative scholarship, that Cornelius had found unexpected peace in acknowledging uncomfortable truths, and that a foundation established in Mrs. Dalrymple's memory was supporting research into ethical collection practices worldwide. He concludes, Holmes read, by noting that what began as one man's campaign to correct ancestral wrongs has evolved into a broader movement questioning how societies preserve history without perpetuating historical crimes. The softly vanished key has opened doors far beyond the sanctum's walls. I set down my brandy, contemplating the remarkable transformation we had witnessed. A singular outcome, Holmes. Crime transmuted into catalyst for institutional reform. Indeed, Watson, and it forces reconsideration of fundamental questions regarding our profession's purpose. Holmes moved to the mantelpiece where the paper and silver crane stood as permanent reminders of the case's philosophical dimensions. We typically view detection as the process of identifying criminals and facilitating punishment. Yet the Ashworth affair demonstrated that investigation itself can serve transformative functions when conducted with sensitivity to moral complexity. He placed Julian's translucent key beside its predecessors, 3 artifacts representing 3 approaches to truth, from the solid certainty of historical possession through the delicate artistry of moral intervention to the transparent clarity of complete understanding. You know, Watson, he continued, his voice taking on that reflective quality I'd learned to associate with his deepest insights, most of our cases end with the snap of handcuffs or the confession of guilt. This one ended with handshakes and the restoration of honor. Julian proved that some things must be lost before they can be truly found. The key that returned to the sanctum was physically identical to the one that left, yet entirely different in meaning. You believe we made the correct choice in facilitating resolution rather than arrest? Holmes turned to face me, his gray eyes reflecting firelight and something deeper, perhaps recognition that even the most brilliant analytical mind must occasionally yield to wisdom that transcends pure logic. Consider the alternative, my dear fellow. Had I exposed Julian's deception immediately through forensic proof, Cornelius would have retreated into denial. The collection would have remained a monument to theft, the family divided by secrets, and the Whitmore descendants denied their rightful acknowledgement. He moved to his violin, drawing the bow across the strings to produce a melody that was at once melancholic and hopeful. Julian understood something profound about the nature of justice, that it operates not merely through punishment, but through transformation. He orchestrated events not as a criminal seeking profit, but as a philosopher seeking truth. We were not merely solving a mystery, Watson. We were participants in a moral drama whose script had been written by a master who understood that some truths must be experienced to be believed. The music filled our sitting room, mingling with the warmth of the fire and the gentle sound of snow against our windows. Outside, church bells began their Christmas celebration across London's covered expanse, their joyful clamor speaking of renewal and hope that seemed peculiarly appropriate to our conversation's themes. "This case will remain among my most significant," Holmes said quietly, placing the violin back in its case. Not because it challenged my deductive abilities, though it certainly did, but because it demonstrated that the greatest mysteries are not always those involving locked rooms and vanished objects, but rather those exploring the human capacity for transformation when confronted with uncomfortable truth. As Christmas morning's first light began painting our windows with pale gold, I found myself profoundly moved by the recognition that our investigation had been not merely solved, but transcended, elevated beyond the mechanical resolution of criminal puzzles into something approaching genuine human connection. The case of the softly vanished key had tested Holmes's abilities in ways that pure intellectual challenges never could, demanding not just brilliant deduction, but moral discernment regarding when law serves justice and when justice requires looking beyond law's rigid boundaries. The key had vanished softly, returned quietly, and in its journey had unlocked something far more valuable than any sanctum door: the possibility that justice, when pursued with patience, artistry, and moral courage, could heal wounds that centuries of conventional remedies had failed to address. The game was concluded, but its lessons would endure, reminding us that sometimes the softest touch achieves what force never could, and that the greatest detective work facilitates transformation rather than merely identifying transgression. Outside, London celebrated Christmas with innocent joy, while within our Baker Street sanctuary, two men contemplated a mystery solved not through punishment, but through revelation, leaving behind not victims and villains, but a family restored to honor, and a detective forever changed by encounter with crime elevated to philosophy.